I woke up to the cold, sterile smell of the operating room, the beeping of the heart monitor echoing in my ears. My chest felt heavy, every breath a reminder that I was supposed to be dead if things hadn't gone right. But the real weight pressing down on me wasn't the aftermath of the surgery, it was the empty chair beside my bed. Sophia had promised she would be there, holding my hand before they wheeled me in, her voice the last thing I'd hear before the anesthesia claimed me. Instead, I'd been staring at the ceiling, watching the clock tick down to the moment I'd go under, alone. 10 minutes before the operation, a nurse had stepped in, her eyes hesitant. "Mr. John, your wife said something urgent came up, she's left the hospital." At first, I thought it was an emergency. Then my phone buzzed with a photo from an old friend, Sophia, in a coffee shop, leaning forward with that familiar smile, talking to Ryan. Ryan, the man she once called her first and last love. The same man she swore she had erased from her life the day she married me. I didn't have the luxury of confronting her. Minutes later, they put me under. The surgeon worked to save my life, but somewhere in the fog of unconsciousness, another truth crystallized. Sophia had already left me long before that day. When I opened my eyes hours later, the room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machines. No flowers, no text, no sign she'd even checked in with the nurses. By the time I was stable enough to be moved, the truth had settled in my chest like ice. I'd survived, but something else inside me had died. That night, when I finally saw her at home, she didn't ask how the surgery went. She didn't even look up from her phone. "You're fine now," she said flatly, scrolling. I asked why she hadn't come. She didn't flinch. Ryan needed someone to talk to. It was important. I laughed, the sound bitter in my ears. "You skipped my surgery for your first love." She met my eyes without a shred of guilt. "You make it sound worse than it is." Her voice was calm, as if she hadn't just torn out what was left of my trust. Something inside me stilled. I remembered the promises she once made, the way she swore she'd be there in my worst moments, the way she'd claimed nothing could pull her away if I needed her. Now I saw those words for what they were, fragile paper vows that crumbled under the smallest weight. We didn't fight. There was no screaming, no throwing things across the room. Instead, there was a quiet, final kind of ending. The kind that creeps in like a shadow and stays. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I didn't tell her where I was going. I didn't even give her the satisfaction of a goodbye. I left a short note on the table. "I'll be gone for a while, don't wait up." Then I blocked her number. Recovery became my responsibility alone. I attended every follow-up, managed my medications, and learned to navigate the dull ache in my chest without anyone to lean on. It was strange how quickly solitude could feel lighter than a relationship built on disappointment. 2 weeks later, at the pharmacy, I heard a familiar voice. "John?" Turning, I saw Deborah, my quiet neighbor from across the hall. She looked genuinely concerned, her gaze lingering on my pale face. "You've lost weight. Were you sick?" I hesitated, then told her about the surgery. She didn't offer pity or change the subject. She simply said, "That must have been hard," and offered to carry my bag. As we walked back, she noticed the worn leather bracelet on my wrist. "That's nice. Was it a gift?" I almost said yes, but then I remembered. It had been Sophia's first birthday present to me, years ago, back when she still looked at me like I was the center of her world. Later, I found out she'd given Ryan the same design in a different color. I kept it anyway, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how easy it was for love to be duplicated. A month later, Sophia appeared outside my building. Her hair was messier than I'd ever seen it, her eyes searching my face. "Why are you avoiding me?" she demanded. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because when I was on the table fighting for my life, you were somewhere else." She scoffed, as if I were being unreasonable. "You're still hung up on that?" Ryan was going through something serious. Her voice was sharp, but to me, it sounded like noise. I walked past her without another word. Deborah, meanwhile, became a quiet constant in my life. She'd leave soup at my door, send a message to remind me about my prescriptions, and never once asked for anything in return. One evening, I thanked her for all she'd done. She smiled faintly. "You think I'm helping you, but you've been helping me too." There was something in her voice, a depth I didn't press her to explain, but it stayed with me. Sophia kept trying to reach me through unknown numbers, her tone shifting from anger to desperation. She claimed she'd cut Ryan off. She said she'd realized what she'd thrown away. But I didn't reply. I had no interest in breathing life back into something that had already rotted from the inside. One evening, she caught me in the lobby. "John, I made a mistake. We can fix this." I shook my head. No, you decided where to be when it mattered most, and it wasn't with me. That's not something I can forget. Her tears fell, but I kept walking until the sound faded behind me. My name is John, and for most of my adult life, I believed I understood the meaning of loyalty. Not the kind that's written on greeting cards or wrapped up in flowery speeches, but the kind that is proven in the quiet, unglamorous moments. It's the loyalty that holds you steady when someone you love is sick, scared, or worn down to the bone. It's the kind I thought I gave freely, and the kind I assumed I was receiving in return. I am a surgeon by profession, a man whose days are measured in the precise rhythm of heart monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and the weight of life or death decisions. My hands have held beating hearts, stitched up torn flesh, and restored breath to people who were seconds away from losing it forever. In my work, you learn quickly that nothing is guaranteed. That's why, in my personal life, I held on tightly to the constants, Sophia most of all. Sophia was not the type to blend quietly into the background. She had a way of walking into a room and owning it without seeming to try. Her hair, always perfectly styled, framed a face that could shift from charm to challenge in the span of a breath. I met her at a charity gala hosted by the hospital 5 years ago. She was there as a guest of one of our sponsors, laughing easily with people I barely had the energy to impress. I wasn't the type to make the first move, but she noticed me from across the room and crossed the space like it was already decided. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she'd said, tilting her head in that way she had when she was already trying to read you. "I'm working," I replied, though it wasn't entirely true. I had already done my rounds for the day. My presence there was more about appearances than necessity. "That's a shame," she said, smiling just enough to keep me hooked. "Because you look like someone worth talking to." That was Sophia, direct, unafraid, and just unpredictable enough to keep you leaning closer. We spent most of the night in conversation, and by the end, I found myself walking her to her car. It felt less like I was making a choice and more like I was following an inevitability. Our relationship escalated quickly. Sophia didn't believe in slow pacing. She wanted dinners, trips, and nights spent together without the in-between of uncertainty. At first, I thought it was because she was confident in what she wanted. Later, I would realize she was simply determined to hold someone's attention before it wandered. Still, I gave her that attention freely. In those early days, I saw sides of her that were warm, even selfless. When I was pulling long shifts during my residency, she would wait outside the hospital with a bag of food, claiming it was no trouble. Sometimes she'd send me short videos of herself cooking, telling me to come home soon before the food got cold. There was laughter in those moments, genuine, unforced laughter that made me think we were building something worth holding on to. She told me about Ryan once, in the kind of offhand way you mention a chapter of your life that feels safely closed. He was her first love, the boy she thought she'd marry. Things ended, she said, because he wasn't ready for the kind of future she wanted. I didn't push for details. Everyone has someone from their past, and it didn't matter to me as long as that's where he stayed. For years, we lived in a rhythm that felt stable, if not perfect. We had our disagreements. She hated how much time I spent at the hospital. I hated how quickly she could turn cold when she didn't get her way, but I always believed we'd find our balance again. She had a tendency to be dramatic, to test boundaries just to see where they were, but I chalked it up to her personality. I proposed on the anniversary of the night we met, outside the same hotel where the gala had been held. She said yes with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this was the kind of forever people fought to keep. The date was set, and though the planning was mostly in her hands, I didn't mind. It made her happy, and I was busy enough with work that I appreciated not having to make decisions about tablecloth colors or floral arrangements. Then came the day of my surgery. It wasn't an emergency, but it was necessary. Damage from an old accident had been worsening, and without the procedure, I'd be looking at serious complications within a few years. Sophia had been there when the doctor first explained it, her hand squeezing mine. "Of course I'll be there," she'd said. "You think I'd let you go through something like that alone?" But on the morning of the operation, the chair beside my bed stayed empty. The nurse's voice was gentle when she told me Sophia had left, but there was no way to soften the blow. My phone buzzed moments later with that photo, Sophia at a cafe, leaning in toward Ryan like the years between them had never happened. I didn't tell the surgical team what I'd seen. They had a job to do, and so did I. stay alive. I went under with the image burned into my mind, and when I woke, the space beside me was still empty. Hours passed. No calls. No messages. I was discharged days later, but when I returned home, Sophia was waiting like nothing had happened. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes flicking toward me but never settling. "It went fine," I said slowly, "but you weren't there." She shrugged, almost impatient. "Ryan needed someone to talk to. You were in good hands. Don't make this a bigger deal than it is." It wasn't her absence that hurt the most, it was the indifference, the complete lack of awareness that she'd chosen to be somewhere else at the exact moment I needed her most. It was in that moment, watching her scroll through her phone as though I were an interruption, that I understood something had shifted beyond repair. Deborah entered my life quietly, almost without me noticing. She lived across the hall, the kind of neighbor who nodded politely in passing but rarely lingered for conversation. The first real exchange we had was in the pharmacy, 2 weeks after my discharge. She spotted me in line, her eyes widening slightly. "John? You look like you've been through something." I told her about the surgery, about the recovery. She didn't offer hollow platitudes or change the subject, she simply listened. "That must have been hard," she said softly, as though acknowledging the weight without trying to carry it for me. She offered to help with my bag, and I found myself letting her. It was nothing romantic then, just the simple act of someone noticing. Still, it stood in stark contrast to the woman I'd come home to. Sophia noticed when my schedule didn't match hers. Deborah noticed when I looked tired. That was the foundation of the truth I hadn't wanted to face. Love, at its core, is measured by where you choose to be when it matters. And on the day my life was in someone else's hands, Sophia chose to be in Ryan's. Even now, I can remember the sound of her voice that night, airy and dismissive, as though I were accusing her of some minor inconvenience instead of betrayal. I remember the way she turned the conversation toward herself, how easily she reframed it as me being overly sensitive. But more than that, I remember the sudden clarity, a quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever we'd been, we weren't that anymore. That certainty would guide every step I took after, from packing my bag the next morning to blocking her number before she could call. It would guide me in the weeks that followed, as Deborah's quiet presence became the only steady thing in my life. And it would remind me, whenever I thought about the woman who once promised forever, that forever only lasts if both people are still showing up. The morning after I blocked Sophia's number, I woke to the rare sound of silence. No alarm, no buzzing phone, no footsteps in the hall outside my apartment. The light filtered in through half-closed blinds, catching on the untouched side of the bed. It was the first time in years I'd woken without the sound of her voice, and instead of the ache I expected, there was only a strange emptiness, like stepping into an operating theater before the instruments are laid out, clean, quiet, uncomplicated. That calm didn't last. By the end of the week, my doorman handed me an envelope. My name was written in Sophia's careful script, the loops in the letters just the way I remembered. Inside, there was no apology, just a single photograph. It was of us at the hospital fundraiser last year, her hand hooked around my arm, her smile perfect for the cameras. On the back, in blue ink, she'd written, "We looked good together, let's talk." I didn't reply. I had no interest in discussing appearances. The betrayal wasn't a matter of public image, it was the fact that when my heart was under a scalpel, hers was sitting across from Ryan in a cafe. Still, she didn't seem to grasp that. Over the next few days, the messages started slipping under my door. Short, sharp lines. "You can't stay mad forever. I was there for you more times than you remember. You owe me a conversation." What I owed her was nothing. 2 weeks into my recovery, I ran into Ryan by chance in the lobby of my building. He was leaning against the reception desk, talking to the concierge like they were old friends. When he spotted me, his easy smile flickered. "John?" he said, as though my name had a bad taste. I didn't slow down. "Ryan." He glanced at the elevator, then back at me. "Sophia's worried about you. She's worried about the wrong person," I cut in, pressing the call button. His brow furrowed, but he didn't push further. The elevator arrived, and I stepped in without looking back. That night, Deborah knocked on my door with a Tupperware container. "You probably haven't eaten," she said matter-of-factly, handing it over. Her tone wasn't pitying, it was practical, the way a nurse might hand you gauze. As I set it on the counter, she glanced at the stack of envelopes on my dining table. She's still trying to contact you? I nodded. She thinks if she keeps knocking, I'll let her back in. Deborah leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Do you want to? No. The answer came out without hesitation, but the truth was more complicated. Wanting her back and wanting her to understand what she'd done were two very different things. She could apologize 100 times, but it wouldn't change the fact that the day of my surgery, she chose someone else. 3 days later, that fact was shoved back in my face. I had just finished a long shift and was walking through the hospital's front doors when I saw her. Sophia was standing by the fountain in the courtyard, her coat open despite the cold. She spotted me instantly, her face lighting up in a way that looked rehearsed. John, she called, her heels clicking as she approached. Finally, I can see you without you running off. I kept walking. You need to stop showing up here. She matched my pace easily. I'm not the enemy. I know you're hurt, but what? I stopped, turning to face her. You had one job that day, Sophia. Be there. You couldn't even do that. Her expression shifted, defensiveness creeping in. Ryan needed me. He was going through something I can't explain to you. You don't have to, I said flatly. You've made it clear where your priorities are. Her jaw tightened. It was one day. It was the day, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. People were starting to glance over, and I stepped back. Go home, Sophia. Stop making this harder than it needs to be. She didn't follow me out. Inside, but I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. That evening, I heard raised voices in the hallway. When I opened my door, Sophia was there, only she wasn't alone. Ryan stood beside her, arms folded, his expression somewhere between smug and protective. You think you're punishing her, he said before I could speak, but you're just proving you can't let go. I glanced at Sophia. Did you bring him here to... What? Intimidate me? Sophia stepped forward. I brought him because you won't listen to me. I wanted you to hear from someone else that I didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed once, low. You skipped the day that could have been my last. You didn't mean to hurt me? That's rich. Ryan shifted, like he wanted to say more, but I closed the door before he could. The next morning, a single text came through from an unknown number. You're twisting this into something it's not. If you cared at all, you'd hear me out. I blocked it without replying. That night, Deborah and I crossed paths in the elevator. She had grocery bags hooked over both arms, and I took half without asking. Rough day? She asked, pressing her floor. You could say that. She didn't push, but when we stepped out, she lingered at her door. You know, people show their truest selves when it's inconvenient to care. It's easy to love someone when nothing's at stake. I nodded slowly, realizing she was right. Sophia had loved me when it was easy, when my work didn't demand sacrifices from her, when her attention didn't have to be divided. But the moment it became inconvenient, she'd retreated to a place where she didn't have to face what that choice meant. The pattern repeated over the next 2 weeks. Notes, messages, sudden appearances. Sophia seemed determined to frame what happened as a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal. And maybe, to her, that's all it was. But to me, it was a fault line that split everything we'd built. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I was walking back from the cafe when I saw her outside my building again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Deborah was there, her arms crossed, her eyes cool. I was just telling Deborah, Sophia said, turning toward me with a thin smile, that you and I need to talk. She thinks you've been avoiding me because you're still angry. Deborah raised an eyebrow. That's not what I said. Sophia's smile faltered. Then what did you say? Deborah glanced at me, then back at her. I said he doesn't owe you anything, and if you can't understand why, then you never will. Sophia's cheeks flushed, and for a moment she looked like she might lash out, but instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, the sound of her boots fading down the street. When we stepped into the elevator, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. You didn't have to do that, I said. I know, Deborah replied, but I wanted to. It was a small moment, but it shifted something in me. It wasn't just that Deborah had defended me, it was that she understood without me having to explain. That kind of understanding couldn't be forced or faked. Of course, Sophia wasn't finished. A few days later, she left a final envelope under my door. Inside was a single sentence, written in bold, angry strokes. If You walk away now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. I set it on the counter, unopened after that, and went about my day. Los subdilos. In the weeks after Sophia's last letter, I found myself walking a fine line between numbness and annoying restlessness I couldn't shake. It was as if I'd trained myself to feel nothing, to keep every reaction buried so deep that even I couldn't reach it. But beneath that surface, there was an ache, a constant hum of questions that I refused to give voice to. I told myself I didn't care why she'd done it, that her reasons wouldn't matter, because the outcome was the same. She wasn't there when she should have been. Still, every time I lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me, my mind wandered back to the image of her sitting across from Ryan. I would imagine the steam curling up from their coffee cups, the way her head tilted when she laughed, the soft press of her hand on his arm. I hated those images, yet they replayed in perfect clarity, each detail cutting deeper. At the hospital, I buried myself in work. My schedule became an unbroken chain of consultations, surgeries, and paperwork. If I kept my hands busy, maybe my mind would quiet. But even in the middle of a procedure, my thoughts would slip. The feel of the scalpel in my hand would fade into the memory of her hand slipping out of mine the day she walked away from my hospital bed. I'd clamp down on the thought, focus on the task in front of me, but the residue would linger. Deborah noticed before I admitted it to myself. One evening, she caught me in the hallway, my tie loosened, my shoulders heavy. "You look like you're running on fumes," she said, leaning casually against her doorframe. "I'm fine," I lied. She studied me for a moment, then tilted her head. Fine is the word people use when they don't want to be asked anything else. That night, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, her words circling in my head. She wasn't wrong, I wasn't fine, I was restless, unsettled, caught in a loop I swore I wouldn't let myself fall into. But breaking free of it was harder than I thought. It wasn't just about letting go of Sophia, it was about letting go of the version of myself that had existed when we were together. The man who believed that loyalty was enough to keep someone by your side. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the storage room, digging through a box I hadn't opened since the move. Inside were small mementos from my time with Sophia, ticket stubs from trips we'd taken, a few photographs, the watch she'd given me on my last birthday. I stared at them for a long time, my chest tight. Each item carried a weight, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a promise that no longer meant anything. I thought about throwing them away, but my hand hesitated. I wasn't ready, not yet. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The suspense came in waves. I never knew when she might show up again, at the hospital, outside my building, in the cafe I'd started visiting to escape the walls of my apartment. Each day without seeing her felt like a small reprieve, but also like waiting for the next strike. When I walked through the hospital lobby, I caught myself scanning the crowd, my stomach tensing whenever I saw a flash of blonde hair. And then there were the dreams. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left me with a hollow feeling when I woke. In them, Sophia would be standing at the foot of my hospital bed, her eyes full of regret. She'd reach for my hand, and just as I started to believe she was there to stay, she would fade into the background, replaced by the image of Ryan smirking from across the room. I'd wake with the sheets tangled around me, the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears. I avoided telling Deborah about the dreams. She had been patient with me, careful not to overstep, and I didn't want to burden her with ghosts from my past. Still, she seemed to sense the undercurrent of tension. One evening, she invited me over for tea, claiming she'd made too much. We sat on her couch, the soft hum of the kettle still lingering in the air. "You're somewhere else tonight," she said gently. I sighed, leaning back. Some days it feels like she's gone, other days it feels like she's standing right behind me. Deborah didn't flinch. "Maybe that's because you haven't decided which version you want to believe." Her words stayed with me long after I left her apartment. She was right. Part of me was still holding on to the version of Sophia I'd loved, the one who had shown up for me without question. But that version didn't exist anymore. The woman who'd skipped my surgery to see her first love had taken her place, and no amount of wishing would bring the old one back. The hardest moments were the quiet ones. After long shifts, when I came home to the stillness of my apartment, I would catch myself expecting to hear her voice, to see her curled up on the couch. The absence was sharp, but it was the absence of familiarity more than love. That distinction was important, but it didn't make the ache any less real. I began to notice how the suspense was shaping my days. Every unknown number that flashed across my phone sent a ripple of tension through me. Every knock at the door made my breath catch. And every time it turned out to be nothing, a delivery, a neighbor, a wrong number, I felt both relieved and strangely disappointed. As much as I wanted her gone from my life, a part of me wanted the confrontation, the final conversation that would leave no room for what-ifs. It wasn't until one Saturday evening that the tension broke, though not in the way I expected. I was leaving the hospital after a late surgery when I saw her leaning against the hood of a black car in the parking lot. She straightened when she saw me, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said simply. I didn't move closer. "About what?" "About us," she replied. "About the fact that you're punishing me for something you refuse to understand." I almost laughed. "I understand perfectly. You made your choice." Her voice sharpened. "It was one day, John. One mistake. And you're willing to throw away everything over it." I took a step forward then, not because I wanted to close the distance, but because I wanted her to hear every word. "It wasn't one mistake, it was the clearest picture I've ever had of who you are, and I'm not interested in living with that version of you." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. I walked past her to my car, feeling her eyes on me the entire time. I didn't look back. Driving home that night, I realized the suspense had been turned. In less about what she might say and more about what I might feel if she ever cornered me like that again. And now I knew, there was no pull, no temptation to forgive. There was only the clean, sharp edge of finality. Still, the emotional struggle didn't vanish overnight. The mind has a way of playing tricks, of slipping back into old grooves. Some mornings I woke thinking of her, and some nights I found myself replaying old conversations, trying to pinpoint the exact moment we started to unravel. But I also began to notice the quiet victories, the days I didn't think of her at all, the moments I found myself laughing at something Deborah said without the laughter feeling forced. It was a slow process, and there were setbacks, but the weight in my chest was beginning to lift, and though the suspense of her next move still lingered at the edges, I was no longer bracing for it. I was learning, day by day, that I could live without the answer to every question she'd left behind. It had been over a month since the parking lot confrontation, and I'd convinced myself Sophia was done trying. The absence of her voice, her notes, her sudden appearances, it was almost eerie. I told myself it was relief I felt, but there was an odd hollowness too, the kind you get when a storm you've been bracing for suddenly changes course without warning. Then, on a Wednesday evening, the storm returned. I was wrapping up paperwork in my office when my phone buzzed with a call from the hospital reception. "Dr. John," the receptionist said, "there's a patient in the lobby asking for you. She says it's urgent." My first thought was that it was one of my follow-ups who'd ignored post-op instructions. My second thought, and the one that made my stomach sink, was Sophia. I told myself I was imagining it, that she wouldn't come here again after the last time. I was wrong. She was sitting on one of the lobby couches, her coat draped over her shoulders, a silk scarf framing her face. When she saw me, she stood, and I realized there was something different about her. She looked thinner, paler, but her eyes, they were steady, calculating in a way that set off an old, familiar warning in my head. "John," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." I didn't move closer. "You shouldn't be here at all." She ignored that. "It's about Ryan." That caught me off guard, though I didn't let it show. "What about him?" Her gaze held mine. "He's been telling people things, about you, about us, things that could hurt your career if they spread." I folded my arms. "Why would he do that?" She hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer wouldn't be straightforward. "Because he thinks I'm still in love with you," she said finally. "And he wants to make sure I never go back." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Sophia, whatever's going on between you and him has nothing to do with me anymore." But then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He told one of his friends, someone with connections to the hospital board, that you botched a surgery years ago and covered it up. I don't know if they believe him, but I thought you should know." I stared at her, weighing every word. There was no botched surgery. The accusation was fiction, but in medicine, PTs, Perception could destroy a career as surely as truth. If this rumor gained traction, it could mean investigations, suspensions, even the loss of my license. You expect me to believe you're warning me out of the goodness of your heart? I asked. Her expression softened, but it felt rehearsed. I expect you to believe that, whatever else has happened between us, I don't want to see you lose everything. I didn't answer. My mind was already running ahead, thinking of who Ryan knew, what kind of reach he had, and how quickly lies could turn into whispers that stuck. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of Ryan meddling in my professional life churned in my gut like acid. I'd spent years building my reputation, my record spotless, my patients trusting me with their lives. The idea of someone tearing that down out of spite was almost more than I could stomach. The next day, Deborah caught me in the lobby, noticing the tightness in my shoulders. Something's wrong, she said without preamble. I told her everything, Sophia's visit, the rumor, the possible fallout. She listened without interrupting, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you believe her? I believe Ryan is capable of it, I admitted, but I also believe Sophia never tells the full story. Deborah's brow furrowed. Then you need to find out what she's leaving out, and you can't do it by ignoring her. The idea of engaging with Sophia again made my skin crawl, but Deborah was right. If this rumor reached the wrong ears, my silence could be mistaken for guilt. I called Sophia that evening, using the number she'd left on a business card in one of her earlier letters. She answered on the first ring, her tone dripping with satisfaction. I knew you'd call. Where's the proof? I asked without a preamble. She laughed lightly. Straight to the point, I don't have proof, but I know where you can get it. I hated myself for asking, where? Ryan's apartment, she said. He keeps everything. Emails, messages, even recordings. If he's talking about you, it'll be there, and I can get you in. I should have ended the call. It sounded reckless, dangerous even, and there was no guarantee she wasn't setting me up. But the thought of sitting back while Ryan threatened everything I'd worked for wasn't an option. 2 nights later, I found myself parked across the street from a sleek high-rise, Sophia in the passenger seat. She was dressed in black, her hair tucked into a scarf, looking more like an accomplice in a heist than the woman who'd once shared my bed. This is insane, I muttered as we crossed the street. Relax, she said. He's out of town, I still have a key. Inside, the apartment was pristine, almost sterile. I followed her to a small home office, where she gestured toward the desk. Check the laptop, he's sloppy with passwords. I hated every second of it, but the thought of finding something that could end this gnawed at me. I tried a few obvious combinations, birthdays, pet names, and on the 4th attempt, the screen unlocked. I clicked through folders, most of them innocuous, then I found one labeled, Notes. Inside were dozens of text documents, each with a date and a name. I opened one at random and froze. It was a transcript of a conversation between Ryan and someone named M, discussing how to make John look incompetent. My name appeared half a dozen times, alongside references to fabricated patient complaints. My pulse was hammered. I copied the files onto a flash drive Sophia had handed me before we came in. That's enough, I said, standing. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Now you see why I came. It to you. We left without incident, but the unease followed me home. That night, I sent the files to a lawyer friend, explaining the bare minimum. He called back within an hour. This is serious, he said. If you can verify these are authentic, you have grounds for legal action. But verification meant confronting Ryan, and confronting Ryan meant stepping back into the orbit of Sophia's world, a world I'd fought to escape. The next day, as I was leaving my apartment, Ryan was waiting by the elevators. He didn't look surprised to see me. You've been busy, he said. I didn't answer, but my silence must have told him enough. His smirk deepened. Careful, John. Dig too deep, and you might find things you don't want to see. For the first time, I felt something sharper than anger, something like anticipation. Whatever this was, it was bigger than Sophia skipping my surgery. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about survival. And I had no intention of losing. The confrontation was inevitable. Every moment after Sophia led me into Ryan's apartment, every word he threw at me in the hallway outside my place, it all pointed toward one conclusion. Sooner or later, the truth would have to be dragged out into the open. And when it came, it wouldn't be quiet. For days, the flash drive with Ryan's incriminating files sat on my desk like a live explosive. My lawyer friend, Mark, kept pushing me to act. "If you want this to stop, you can't sit on it," he told me over the phone. "Every day you wait is another day the rumors have room to grow." But there was something about the whole thing that didn't add up. Why would Ryan risk making up lies about me unless he thought he was untouchable? And why was Sophia suddenly playing my ally after everything she'd done? The answer came in the form of a phone call I didn't expect, from Deborah. Her voice was tight, urgent. "John, you need to come to the Riverside Hotel, now." I didn't waste time asking questions. 10 minutes later, I was pulling into the valet lane, my mind racing through possibilities. Deborah was waiting just outside the lobby, her arms crossed, her expression grim. "He's here," she said. "Ryan, with Sophia. I don't think you're going to like what you see." She led me inside, through the lounge, and into one of the smaller conference rooms. The door was cracked open just enough for us to see in. Sophia sat at the far end of the table, her body angled toward Ryan, who was leaning back in his chair, smirking in that infuriating way he did. Between them was a laptop, and on the screen was a familiar folder, my folder, the same one I'd pulled from his computer. "And once he tries to use this," Ryan was saying, "we flip it. Make it look like he planted it himself. Easy, I've already got half the board thinking he's been sloppy in surgeries lately. This will just seal it." Sophia's laugh was low, almost fond. "You're ruthless." "Only with people who deserve it," Ryan replied. Deborah glanced at me, her eyes full of the same disbelief boiling in my chest. All this time, I'd thought Sophia was trying to warn me, maybe even make amends, but she'd been feeding him the rope to hang me. I didn't wait for the perfect moment. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my voice cutting through their conversation. "Don't stop on my account." Ryan's smirk faltered, but Sophia's eyes widened, genuine surprise flickering there for the first time in months. "John? Save it," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapping the screen to end the recording I'd been making since Deborah called me. "You might want to know, the last 2 minutes are already backed up to a secure drive." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You think anyone's going to believe that? I could say you faked it. Hell, I could." "You could try," I interrupted, stepping closer, "but I have the original files from your computer, and I didn't get them from Sophia. She just happened to be dumb enough to confirm them on tape." Sophia's face went pale. "John, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I snapped. "You came to me pretending to help, just so you could see what I had and report back to him. You didn't skip my surgery for a misunderstanding, Sophia. You skipped it because loyalty means nothing to you unless it benefits you in the moment." Her mouth opened, closed. For once, she didn't seem to have a line prepared. Ryan stood, squaring his shoulders like he thought he could intimidate me. "You're making a mistake, John. You go public with this, and I promise you I'll drag your name through the mud so deep you'll never work again." I took a step closer, meeting his glare with one of my own. "The difference between us, Ryan, is that I don't need to lie to win. You've been sloppy, you've left a trail, and now you've handed me your confession. This isn't about rumors anymore, it's about criminal intent. You've been conspiring to fabricate evidence against a surgeon in a public hospital. Do you know how fast that's going to land you in front of a judge?" For the first time, I saw a crack in his confidence. It was small, but it was enough. Sophia pushed her chair back, her voice trembling now. "John, you can't do this, you don't understand." "No," I said, cutting her off. "I understand perfectly. You think you can walk into my life, tear it apart, and then rewrite the story so you come out clean. But I've learned something from all this. You can't rewrite the truth when it's been recorded in real time." I turned to leave, but Ryan's voice followed me. "You won't get away with this." I paused in the doorway, looking back at him. "I already have." Deborah was waiting just outside, her phone in her hand. "I got most of it," she said quietly. "Between your recording and mine, we've got them from every angle." Mark's reaction when I called him was immediate. "Bring me everything," he said. "We'll file for an injunction to stop them from spreading anything else, and then we go to the board." The next week was a blur of meetings, legal paperwork, and carefully worded statements. Ryan tried to backpedal, claiming the files were fictional drafts for a private story project. The board didn't buy it. His credibility evaporated, and with it, Sophia's last shred of influence. But the real confrontation came later, when Sophia showed up outside my apartment for what I knew would be the last time. She looked different, tired, her makeup smudged like she hadn't slept. "John, please," she said. "I didn't know it would go that far. I thought if I played along with him, I could protect you." I stared at her, weighing whether any part of that could be true. "You had a chance to protect me the day of my surgery," I said finally. "And you chose to be somewhere else. This was just you doing the same thing in a different way." Her eyes shimmered, but I didn't soften. "I'm done, Sophia. Whatever we were, it's over, and this time, it's not because I walked away, it's because I've finally seen you for who you are." She reached out like she might touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Goodbye, Sophia." The door shut between you, with a finality I felt in my bones. Later that night, sitting on my couch with Deborah beside me, I felt something I hadn't in months: stillness. Not the heavy, suffocating kind, but the kind that comes when a storm has finally passed. The confrontation had stripped away the last illusions I'd been holding on to. There was no going back to the man who thought love could survive on loyalty alone. There was only the man who had fought for his name, his career, and, in a way, his own self-respect, and that man had no room left for Sophia, or for the shadows she'd tried to drag back into his life. The board moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks of handing over the recordings and the files, they had convened a formal hearing. Ryan was called in first, his once slick confidence replaced by the stiff body language of a man who knew he was cornered. I sat in the back of the room with my lawyer, Mark, listening as he stumbled through half-baked excuses about misunderstandings and creative drafts. None of it stuck. The members of the board asked pointed, relentless questions, and each answer only tightened the noose around him. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't have to embellish. I laid out the facts plainly: the timeline of my surgery, the rumor campaign, the theft and fabrication of patient records. I presented the files I'd pulled from his laptop, the recordings Deborah and I had made at the Riverside Hotel, and the witness statements from 2 colleagues who had overheard Ryan making insinuations about my work. By the time I finished, the room was silent except for the rustle of papers. The verdict came that afternoon. Ryan was to be reported to the Medical Ethics Board and blacklisted from all affiliated hospitals in the region. His consulting contracts were cancelled and his license would be under review PK, ending further investigation. It wasn't just a career blow, it was a public disgrace. As for Sophia, the board didn't have jurisdiction over her, but the damage was done. Word of her involvement spread quickly through our professional and social circles. Invitations that once flooded her calendar dried up. Friends who used to hang on her every word now avoided her entirely. She tried reaching out to me again after the hearing, leaving voicemails thick with a mix of indignation and desperation, but I didn't respond. The more she pushed, the more irrelevant her voice became. But I wasn't done. Mark and I filed a defamation suit against Ryan, supported by the evidence we'd gathered. We also filed a restraining order against both him and Sophia to prevent further contact. I knew the case would take time, but it wasn't about the money, it was about setting a precedent. No one would ever again think they could dismantle my life without consequence. The real closure, though, came from something quieter. A week after the hearing, Deborah invited me over for dinner. We sat at her small dining table, the warm scent of roasted vegetables filling the air. It was the first evening in months where I felt no trace of tension pulling at my shoulders. "You're free now," she said simply, pouring me a glass of wine. I nodded. Free and still standing. She studied me for a moment, then smiled. "That's the best kind of victory." It was. But it wasn't until the following Friday that I understood just how complete that victory could feel. I was leaving the hospital after a long shift when I saw a familiar figure standing by the fountain in the courtyard. Sophia. She looked nothing like the woman who used to stride into rooms with her head held high. Her hair was unkempt, her makeup smudged. When she saw me, she took a step forward, her voice trembling. "John, please, I just want to talk." I stopped a safe distance away. "There's nothing left to say." Tears welled in her eyes. "I lost everything because of you." I shook my head slowly. "No, Sophia, you lost everything because of you. I just made sure the truth came out." Her lips parted, but no words came. I turned and walked away without looking back. That night, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee, the city lights stretching out before me, I felt the final pieces of the last few months settle into place. I'd been betrayed, targeted, and nearly destroyed. But I had fought back, methodically, decisively, and I had won. Not just in the eyes of the board, but in my own. The defamation case would take its course, and I'd let it. The restraining orders would hold. Sophia and Ryan would be footnotes in my history, not defining chapters. The next morning, Deborah knocked on my door with a small box in her hands. "I made you something," she said, handing it over. Inside was a bracelet, woven leather, sturdy, understated. "So you can finally replace that old one," she said with a teasing smile. I fastened it around my wrist, feeling the smooth texture under my fingers. "It's perfect." We ended up spending the day together, walking through the park, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time, the future felt like an open road instead of a battlefield. Months later, the court ruled in my favor. Ryan was ordered to pay damages and issue a formal public apology, which was printed in the same medical journal he had once tried to poison against me. Sophia didn't appear at the proceedings. She'd vanished from most public spaces by then, but word of her association with him was included in the court documents, a permanent reminder of her role. The final act of my revenge wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. One afternoon, I walked past the cafe where I'd once imagined her laughing with Ryan on the day of my surgery. It was closed, the windows papered over, a for-lease sign in the glass. I stood there for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but to acknowledge the symmetry. The place where the first cut had been made was now empty, stripped of its glamour, forgotten by the city. I turned away, the air lighter in my lungs than it had been in months. Life moved forward. Deborah and I grew closer, our connection steady and unforced. She never tried to erase the past, but she also never let it define us. In her presence, I didn't feel like a man recovering from betrayal. I felt like a man living a life worth protecting. One night, as we sat together on my balcony watching the city lights, she said, "You know, sometimes closure isn't about walking away. Sometimes it's about making sure the door behind you locks shut." I smiled at that. Then I guess I've locked mine for good. And I had. The revenge was complete, the closure was real, and for the first time since Sophia had left that chair empty on the day of my surgery, I knew I'd never look back.